Count the Primarchs. The Imperium will help you. There are statues. There are records. There are 10,000 years of history built around the number 20. You will count the first. Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels, rediscovered on Caliban in 846.M30. You will count all the way to the 20th, Alpharius of the Alpha Legion, officially the last to be found in 981.M30. And twice, at the 2nd and the 11th, you will find nothing. In the falls of the Kath Mandau Precinct of the Imperial Palace, there is a room called the Investiary. 20 plinths of ouslite marble, arranged in a silent ring. Each one once carried the likeness of a Primarch. And Rogal Dorn, who stood in that room during the darkest days of the Horus Heresy, looked at 2 plinths holding nothing and wrote, "The 2nd and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time. No one ever spoke of those 2 absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded?" That quote comes from the Dan Abnett short story, The Lightning Tower. It's one of the most direct canonical acknowledgments Games Workshop has ever made about the 2 missing sons. 2 plinths, 2 separate tragedies, 2 names that even the surviving brothers refuse to speak aloud. The lore community has spent decades in that room, staring at those empty plinths, arguing over which of the 2 vanished sons was the so-called Null Primarch. One theory assigns cowardice to the 2nd. Another casts the 11th as a rebel who turned defiant against the Emperor himself. A third suggests xenocontamination. A fourth reaches toward Blood Raven's ancestry with the enthusiasm of a man grasping at smoke. The debate has run for years, passionate, detailed, and circular by design because it's built on a premise that makes resolution impossible. Every thread of that debate makes the same assumption.
Every argument about the Null Primarch starts from the premise that the entity must occupy one of the 20 numbered slots. That the Null must be the 2nd or the 11th, because those are the only vacancies the sequence offers. The community has been arguing in the right room. It has been staring at the wrong walls. The Null Primarch isn't missing from the sequence. He precedes it. He is number 0, and he was never meant to have a legion. To understand why this reframe holds, why it isn't wishful thinking but the only deduction that doesn't break something, you need to start where every Primarch argument should start: the numbering system itself. The Primarch project began in M29 beneath the Himalayan mountains of Terra. The Emperor, working alongside the perpetual Erda and biotechnical division director Amar Astarte, grew 20 genetically engineered sons in accelerated gene culturing chambers. The Lexicanum's Primarch project article confirms the scope. An army of 20 legions of superhuman warriors, each led by a genetic sire known as a Primarch. 20 Primarchs, 20 legions. The sequence ran 1 through 20. That isn't in dispute. The fandom wiki, the Lexicanum, a Spanish academic translation glossary, and an academic fan film study all agree on the number 20. It's the most consistent fact in the entire lore. What isn't consistent, what the lore has quietly left ambiguous across decades of publication, is what that numbering actually means. Here is the fact most community debate glosses over. Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's most beloved son, his chosen war master, the first among his generals. Horus was the first Primarch to be rediscovered during the Great Crusade. He was found on Thonia in 801.M30. He was first. His legion's designation was the 16th. The 16th. If the numbering tracked discovery order,
Horus would be one. He isn't. He never was.
The Fandom Wiki's own Primarch article contains two completely separate lists. One for the numerical sequence, one for the order of rediscovery of the Primarchs, and they aren't the same list. Horus is first in discovery and 16th in sequence. Corvus Corax is 19th in sequence and 18th in discovery. Alpharius is 20th in sequence, but his discovery date, 981.M30, places him near the end only by coincidence. The Lexicanum confirms the 11th Primarch's discovery is listed at 927.M30, 19th in discovery order, despite being 11th in sequence. These two systems don't track each other. The Bolter and Chainsword Forum, in an October 2022 thread titled, "Why Are the Legions Numbered So?" reached the conclusion that community consensus leans toward the numbers reflect the order in which the Primarchs were created in their gene-culturing pods. One poster put it plainly. The legions carry the numeric designation of their Primarchs, that is, their order of inception in the Primarch project. Another noted that the Valdor novel hints this system may have inherited its numbering from the earlier Thunder Warrior legions. The Emperor simply continued the counting convention. A creation label. The number stamped on the gestation pod in a gene lab beneath the Himalayan mountains before any of those suns ever breathed free air. An administrative designation assigned at inception, not at deployment, not at discovery, not at the moment the Great Crusade required a general. And if the numbers are creation labels, not discovery labels, not ontological facts about reality, then the boundary of that sequence is exactly as firm as the Emperor's deliberate intention when he designed the project. It isn't a physical law, it's a filing system. Filing systems have room for a prologue entry. They always have. Now look at what the 2nd and 11th actually tell us, not what the theories say. What the canonical record says, which is mostly what the canonical record doesn't say. The official imperial account of both Primarchs consists primarily of structured absence. The Lost Primarchs article on the Fandom Wiki names the mechanism precisely: a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. The formal imperial policy of deliberately destroying all records, icons, monuments, and symbols pertaining to an individual declared excommunicate traitoris. And the article is specific. The complete and utter erasure of all records of the 2nd and 11th legions is considered by imperial historians as the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in imperial history. The most successful in imperial history. That isn't a small qualifier in a galaxy that has been practicing institutional obliteration for 10,000 years. The canonical language in imperial records does not say lost or classified. It says, in formal archive phrasing, all records expunged, deleted. Bell of Lost Souls has paraphrased the in-universe record as stating Legions 2 and 11 are listed as having all records expunged from the library. The first Heretic novel establishes that their erasure from imperial records occurred at least 43 standard years before the drop site massacre at Istvan V, meaning this happened deep in the Great Crusade era, well before the heresy. When Corvus Corax was reunited with the Emperor on deliverance in 922 M30, the Emperor told him he had brothers. Corax counted and came up short. The conversation, recorded in the novel Deliverance Lost, goes this way. Corax says, 17? The Emperor's expression, the text describes, grew bleak, filled with deep sorrow. His response, the other two. That is a conversation for another day.
It never came.
In the novel Fear to Tread, Sanguinius rounds on Horus when asked why he hadn't sought the Emperor's help for the Blood Angel's genetic flaw. "I won't have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as my legion's only memorial." Third. He says third. He knows there are already two, and he describes them as a memorial, the kind of word you use for something shameful and finished, not for something hidden and ongoing. Vulcan, during the Crusade, tells his equerry, "None of us wants another sanction, another empty pillar in the great Investiary, another brother's name excised from all record. It's shame enough to bear the grief for two." Grief, shame, not a classified asset, not a hidden weapon, a burden. The novel Deliverance Lost is the source for the detail that has entered community discussion most frequently, the mind-scrubbing. Only the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite retained any knowledge of who the 2nd and 11th had been. The memories were removed from the surviving Primarchs. This is the decisive detail. It's what separates the failures from the hypothesis of Primarch Zero. There is a categorical difference between hiding a secret and burying a shame. A hidden weapon is classified. Its existence is compartmentalized, placed behind need-to-know protocols. The people who need to know. That is operational security. What happened to the 2nd and 11th wasn't operational security. It was the most thorough institutional obliteration in Imperial history, applied with enough force to scour the memories of the Emperor's most trusted sons. You don't mind-scrub your allies to protect a weapon you still need. You do that when the thing you're erasing is a catastrophic failure, something so damaging to the project, so corrosive to morale or mission, that its continued existence in memory is a liability.
And Games Workshop itself, in a Forge World article from January 2022 titled, "We asked Forge World how they designed all 18 Primarchs," used the number 18 as the operational total. Not 20 with asterisks, not 20 with 2 blanks, 18. GW's own design team treats the 2nd and 11th slots as genuinely empty, failed, gone. Now here is where the community's argument collapses in on itself. The central premise of every theory that assigns the null role to the 2nd or 11th is that one of those vanished sons was a psychic blank, a carrier of the pariah gene, either secretly preserved or deliberately concealed as an anti-warp countermeasure after his formal record was destroyed. Set aside the question of which Primarch for a moment. Apply the lore's own rules to the base claim. A psychic blank registers as an absence in the warp. The Lexicanum's article on blanks states the effect directly. The pariah gene creates not just a personal psychic void, but an active disruption of warp energy in the surrounding area. Their presence suppresses psychic phenomena. It causes physical and psychological discomfort in psychers nearby. The fandom wiki's Sisters of Silence article describes how the strongest blanks project null fields that function as howling abysses of darkness in the psychic spectrum, not simply an absence but an active interference. Demonic entities are repulsed. Psychers find their abilities compromised, hazardous, sometimes completely negated. That is what a blank does. Now consider what a Primarch is. The Primarch project, per the Lexicanum, involved forbidden sciences and arcane lore derived from the warp. The Primarchs were woven into the fabric of the immaterium at their creation. Their souls burn bright in the warp. This isn't flavor text. It's the mechanism by which the Chaos Gods noticed them and scattered them across the galaxy in 792.m30. It's the reason the Emperor carefully inscribed arcane glyphs of protection on the Primarch's gestation capsules and crafted the most powerful Geller field ever made around the gene vault. He was protecting them from the warp's attention precisely because they shone so brightly in it. A blank Primarch is a biological paradox, a being defined by its intense warp presence, created through warp-derived methods, genetically rooted in the Emperor's own psychic template, and simultaneously a carrier of the pariah gene, which is antagonistic to psychic presence at its most fundamental level. This isn't a minor lore wrinkle. Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno, states explicitly that neither Space Marines nor Custodians can be blanks. The gene seed process itself is incompatible with the pariah gene.
The reasoning, as the Sisters of Silence article articulates, is that gene seed carries a shadow of the Emperor's own genetic material, a thread of his enormous psychic power, and this is likely a holy anathema to the pariah gene, and likely simply kill its implanted subject. If ordinary Astartes gene seed can't support the pariah gene, then a Primarch's genome, which is the original template that Astartes gene seed is derived from, several steps closer to the Emperor's own psychic blueprint, would be even more fundamentally hostile to Null genetics. The Reddit community thread asking who is/was the blank or Null Primarch landed here on its own. The evidence in the lore points to a blank Primarch being impossible considering their warp vibes. So the 2nd or 11th can't be the Null Primarch without breaking the biological rules of the setting. That is, contradiction kill 1. Kill 2 is the Psyker poisoning problem.
Great Crusade legions employed librarians, psychic space marines, routinely before the Council of Nicaea in 001.M3.1 formally restricted them. The council was convened precisely because librarians were widespread and their use was becoming contentious. A Null Primarch stationed at the head of a legion would inherently suppress his own librarian's abilities, create an atmosphere of existential psychic wrongness for every psyker in his order of battle, and render his force partially dysfunctional against exactly the enemies a Null field would be most valuable against. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves provides a comparison point here. An aggressively anti-psyker Primarch, deeply hostile to sorcery. But Russ had no Null field. His resistance to warp manipulation was ideological and temperamental, not radiological. There is a difference between hating psychers and suppressing them with your passive existence.
Only one of those two things makes your own legion psychers dangerous to operate around.
Kill 3 is the most decisive. If the Null Primarch was the Emperor's most critical anti-warp asset, his dedicated warp anchor, his irreplaceable Null keystone, then why did the Emperor destroy him? The Emperor does not destroy things that work. The Sisters of Silence continued operating across the Horus Heresy and into M42. The Webway project, despite Magnus's catastrophic sabotage, was never voluntarily abandoned. The Emperor held the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, rather than allow the warp breach beneath the palace to collapse. The Custodies were never disbanded. The Astronomicon continued burning. When the Emperor builds a system that serves its purpose, he maintains it regardless of cost. Losing 9,000 custodians in the Webway tunnels over 5 years of demonic warfare didn't make him disband the Custodies. It made the surviving Custodies redouble their vigil.
A Null Primarch of sufficient power to serve as the Emperor's primary anti-warp anchor would be the single most valuable non-combatant in the Imperium. The Emperor would no more destroy him than he would voluntarily abandon the Webway project or dismiss the Sisters of Silence. He would classify him, conceal him, never speak of him to anyone who didn't absolutely need to know. Instead,
What the 2nd and 11th received was the most complete institutional obliteration in Imperial history. The manner of their erasure, mind scrubbing, record deletion, damnatio memoriae applied with unprecedented thoroughness, isn't what you do to a weapon you need. It's exactly what you do to a catastrophic failure whose continued memory would damage the mission. Disgrace gets buried. Strategic assets get protected. The 2nd and 11th were buried. That leaves a genuine problem. If the Null Primarch exists, and to be precise, this is a theory, not confirmed Black Library canon, then where is he?
The 2nd and 11th are eliminated not by dismissing the Null concept, but by applying the lore's own rules to it. The concept survives. The candidates don't. There is a community theorist whose framing started this whole line of thinking. The argument, circulating across fan forums and YouTube commentary. I think the Null March is actually numbered 0. 2 was probably a coward and 11 probably rose up in defiance. The Null March is an entity all its own. This is a fan theory. No Black Library novel names it. No Games Workshop codex confirms it. But it's also the only framing of this problem that doesn't shatter on contact with the rules of the setting. The Null March is an entity all his own, completely separate from the failures of the Great Crusade. What if the Null isn't a missing number in the sequence? What if he's a prologue page that was never included in the bound volume, never meant to be? Before you dismiss this, look at the pattern of what the Emperor actually built before the Crusade began. The Primarch project wasn't the first time the Emperor created specialized, purpose-built transhuman assets outside the standard military framework. He has a documented history of doing exactly this for exactly this kind of purpose. The Adeptus Custodes predate the Primarch project or run contemporaneous with its earliest phases. The Bolter and Chainsword's comprehensive Custodes history notes that from the earliest accounts of the Unification Wars, the Emperor was already surrounded by warriors in golden plate. Their numbers grew slowly, from 2 or 4 to 10, then to hundreds by the end of the Unification Wars. Each one individually crafted through a gene alchemy process completely distinct from Astartes' Geneseed implantation. The Lexicanum's Primarch article confirms the underlying principle. Custodian genetics are one step removed from the actual DNA of the Emperor himself, derived from his undifferentiated, pure Primarch gene stock template before it was differentiated into the 20 individual Primarch strands. Reddit community discussion paraphrases the Watchers of the Throne novel accurately. Custodes are created using technology dating to the Dark Age of technology, honed by the Emperor to produce the perfect counselors, bodyguards, warriors. Every custodian takes years to make. None of them emerge from a Legion Geneseed production line. Each is, in a meaningful sense, a unique creation. Their primary function is the Emperor's personal protection and the wardenship of the Imperial Palace, functions the Astartes legions explicitly can't fill. The Custodes aren't blanks. They have no null field.
Their relevance here isn't that they are anti-warp assets in a psychic sense. They are warriors who fight demons through martial power and conditioning, not through null radiation. Their relevance is what they prove about the Emperor's design philosophy. He will build purpose-specific, individually crafted transhuman entities outside the Astartes framework when the mission demands it. He has done it before, repeatedly. The Sisters of Silence are more directly relevant to the Null hypothesis. The Fandom Wiki's article on them, the most comprehensive publicly available source, confirms they were formally organized during the Great Crusade into an all-female order of psychic nulls, each one carrying the pariah gene as a natural mutation. Their null auras actively disrupt psychic phenomena. Their presence suppresses demonic manifestations.
The most senior warriors, the Oblivion Knights, develop their null abilities to the point where any use of psychic power in their presence is extremely hazardous to the user. They were deployed not as general infantry, but in precise surgical strikes. The Lexicanum's Sisters of Silence article describes them during the War Within the Webway, deployed alongside the Custodes in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, fighting demonic incursions, holding the line in an environment where conventional Astartes would have been shredded by the psychic forces arrayed against them. They held that line for 5 years. The Sisters weren't a backup force. They were the specific tool for the specific problem that no other asset in the Imperium could address. They proved something the Custodes only imply. The Emperor specifically builds and organizes dedicated, standalone anti-warp null assets outside the Legion framework. And then there is the Webway Project. The Lexicanum's Webway Project article is precise about scope. The Webway Project, also known as the Imperial Webway and the Emperor's Great Work, was a highly secretive project by the Emperor of Mankind during the Great Crusade and likely long before. Its ultimate objective, stated without ambiguity in the same source, to completely sever humanity from the warp in its entirety, depriving chaos of its power. Not to reduce chaos's power, not to limit it, to sever humanity from the warp entirely, to make the warp irrelevant to human civilization as a medium of travel, communication, or spiritual exposure. The most ambitious strategic infrastructure project in human history. The Emperor kept this secret from every Primarch. The Lexicanum records the consequence with a single sentence of devastating understatement. Not even the Primarchs knew why the Emperor returned to Terra, and this created a degree of resentment among many, especially Horus, his chosen war master, his most beloved son, who was, at that very moment, being tempted toward rebellion partly by the feeling of paternal abandonment, didn't know why his father had left. Because what was happening beneath the palace mattered more than managing Horus's feelings. The Golden Throne, the device that now sustains the Emperor's dying body, was originally built as the psychic regulator controlling the gate into the human-made webway tunnels. The Emperor's own psychic power, channeled through the throne, held the gate and protected the tunnels from demonic intrusion. When Magnus the Red's rituals shattered those wards, demons poured through in their thousands. The Custodes and Sisters fought them for 5 years in the tunnels. Per the Bolter and Chainsword's Custodes history, the war within the webway cost 9,000 custodians their lives, 9,000 of the 10,000. The Sisters suffered commensurate casualties. By the siege of Terra, the Emperor's personal guard had been bled to a shadow of its former strength. That cost is the proof of how important the Webway project was. You don't spend 9,000 custodians on something incidental, and you don't lose 9,000 custodians and then let the thing they died protecting be quietly abandoned. Malcador the Sigillite, who understood the Emperor's strategic thinking better than anyone else alive, is described in the novel Master of Mankind as framing the Webway project as one of several methods to shield humanity from chaos. One of several, not the only method. A layer in a defensive architecture that the Emperor had been building across decades, possibly centuries. Multiple parallel systems, multiple redundancies, multiple fail-safes. That is the pattern. Custodes as elite bespoke bodyguard force. Sisters of Silence as organized null strike teams. Webway project as infrastructure-level warp bypass. Malcador as psychic regent and stand-in.
shadow keepers as vault wardens, layer upon layer upon layer, each designed to function independently, each filling a specific gap that the others can't cover. In that pattern, in the context of an architect who builds parallel systems, who creates bespoke tools for specific threats, who keeps his most important projects secret even from his most trusted sons, a standalone, pre-sequenced null entity created outside the Primarch project to serve as a dedicated anti-warp structural anchor isn't unprecedented. It fits the pattern exactly. Here is the forensic argument for Primarch 0, stated plainly. The Emperor's fundamental strategic problem is chaos, not a single enemy, not a campaign to win. An existential, civilizational scale threat that exists as long as humanity exists. Because humanity generates the warp emotions that feed it, and the warp generates the demonic pressure that threatens humanity.
This problem can't be solved by winning a battle.
It requires architecture. The Sisters of Silence give him a mobile null force, human blanks organized into a precision weapon deployable at operational need. The Webway project gives him an infrastructure-level solution. Sever the dependency on warp travel entirely. The Custodies give him an elite, bespoke bodyguard whose loyalty is genetically reinforced at the cellular level. But none of these fully solve the problem of Terra itself. The Sisters are mobile and finite. They can be killed, routed, deployed elsewhere. The Webway project requires continuous active psychic anchoring by the Emperor personally, which means it fails if the Emperor is impaired. The Custodies are warriors, not warp suppressors. What the anti-warp architecture is missing is a passive structural element, something that doesn't require the Emperor's direct attention, something that doesn't need to be deployed or recalled.
Something built into the infrastructure itself, generating its null field continuously, requiring no maintenance, no orders, no consciousness, simply existing as a function of what it is. A blank's null field is passive. It exists as long as the blank exists. A blank doesn't choose to suppress psychic phenomena any more than a stone chooses to be heavy. The Sisters of Silence don't activate their null fields. They simply are what they are, and the null field follows from their nature. A null entity at Primarch scale, built outside the sequence of 20 before the Primarch project was formalized, at a moment when the Emperor was still designing his anti-warp architecture from first principles, would represent a structural element. Not a weapon to be aimed, a component, something the architecture can't function without, and which therefore must never leave its position. The Sisters of Silence article in the Fandom Wiki contains a passage that gestures at this concept in almost exactly these terms. The text speculates. It can only be speculated that if even a single legion of psychic null legiones Astartes had been possible, how very different history may have been. The lore acknowledges the concept, a null force at legion scale, and notes immediately that it wasn't possible because of genocide incompatibility. It says a null legion was impossible. It does not say a null entity at Primarch scale was impossible. Those are different claims. The absence of a canonical example isn't the same as a canonical prohibition. No canonical text says the Emperor never created a pre-sequenced null entity. The canon is silent, and the Emperor has a documented history of building things the canon doesn't announce. The Webway project was the Empire's greatest secret, hidden from even his own sons. One objection is worth answering directly. The Emperor is described in the Lexicanum as using his immense psychic powers to constantly keep the Chaos Gods in the warp at bay, preventing their intrusion into the material universe.
He is the most powerful human psyker in existence. His own presence is described as naturally anathema to demonic entities. Why would he need a null anchor when he himself is the most powerful psychic bulwark imaginable? Because he can't be in two places at once. He can't craft Primarchs in gene labs while simultaneously fighting daemons in the webway tunnels. He can't run the Great Crusade and permanently seal every warp breach on Terra by direct personal attention. He can't be both mortal body on Terra and omnipresent guardian of every point where the Imperium threatens to intrude.
The entire architecture of his preparatory work, the Custodies, the Sisters, the Webway Project, Malcador as regent, is the infrastructure of a being who knows he can't do everything himself and builds systems to extend his will where his attention can't be sustained. Active psychic anchoring requires continuous effort. Active defenses fail when the defender is impaired. The Webway Project was meant to replace active defense with structural immunity, to make it so the warp simply couldn't reach Terra, regardless of whether the Emperor was watching. Primarch Zero, in the argument being laid out here, isn't a substitute for the Emperor. He is another layer in the same architecture, the one that continues to function when the active systems are compromised. The Golden Throne is still active. The Astronomicon still burns. The Shadowkeepers still stand their watch. Some of the Emperor's most important creations have outlasted his ability to consciously direct them. They were built to. Beneath the Imperial Palace, below the gene labs where the 20 Primarchs were grown, below the Imperial Dungeon where Malcador and his unifiers built the human webway tunnels, deeper still into the holy bedrock of Terra, there are places that most inhabitants of the palace don't know exist. The Fandom Wiki's Imperial Palace article describes the sublevels in concrete terms. Its sublevels dig deep into Terra's holy bedrock, in some places reaching a depth of hundreds of kilometers below the surface. The palace is a continent. Its depths are older than the Great Crusade, older than some of the Emperor's own plans. Chambers exist down there that modern inhabitants of the palace can't access, can't name, can't explain. The Lexicanum's entry on the Sanctum Imperialis identifies one specific deep location. The dungeon was built deep underground by the Emperor to be the linchpin of his grand ambition. A linchpin, the thing around which everything else turns. The original gene laboratory complex was down there.
Emperor's original workshops, the starting point of everything. Deeper still is what one in-universe historian, Corin Celsius Historicus, designated the Forbidden Vault, an unnamed chamber beneath the throne room. The access restrictions were set so long ago and have been maintained so consistently that their original purpose may have been forgotten by those who now enforce them. The Lexicanum's Imperial Palace article records only that none may enter it without authorization, that no living official seems capable of granting. And then there are the dark cells, the vaults of Rhython. The Shadowkeepers, a specific Custodes formation established for exactly this purpose, maintain their eternal vigil over these chambers. The Fandom Wiki confirms the dark cells hold entities and artifacts that the Emperor deemed too dangerous ever to be released. Not failed experiments, not trophies.
Things the Emperor specifically chose to place there, chose to lock away, chose to have watched by his most elite warriors for 10,000 unbroken years. The Shadowkeepers don't question their charge. They don't know, in many cases, precisely what they guard. They guard because the Emperor told them to, through the chain of command and tradition that has persisted since before the heresy. And that chain hasn't broken across 100 centuries. In the M42 era,
After the Great Rift opened and split the galaxy, some of the dark cells were reportedly found to have altered contents. Something moved. Something changed. The Shadow Keepers discovered that certain vaults weren't quite as they had been. Not empty, not destroyed, changed. If Primarch Zero exists, and this is theory, stated as such, this is where he is. Not dead, not erased, not given a damnatio memoriae, because you can't condemn the memory of something that was never written into the record.
Simply waiting, in the silence the Emperor built for him, in the dark that hasn't shifted in 10,000 years while the Imperium above him lurched from one catastrophe to the next. He was never in the Investiary. He was never among the 20 plinths. He was never part of the project that produced the 20 sons who fought the Great Crusade, led legions across 1,000,000 worlds, and ultimately broke the Imperium in half during the Horus Heresy. He was built before that project, for a different purpose, in a room that does not appear in any record because the Emperor's most important rooms never did. The debate about the 2nd and 11th will continue. It should. The mystery of the two empty plinths is one of the richest creative spaces Games Workshop has ever left deliberately open, and the theories that try to fill it reflect genuine engagement with the lore's texture, its silences, its patterns of misdirection. The community hasn't been wrong to look there. It has been looking with the wrong frame. Every argument that assigns the null role to the 2nd or 11th assumes the sequence of 20 is a hard boundary, that if something is missing, it must be missing from inside that boundary. But the Emperor's most important creations don't necessarily appear in the administrative record of the Primarch project. The Webway project didn't appear in any Legion's campaign history. The Shadow Keeper's specific charge wasn't publicly announced. The Sisters of Silence, per their own fandom wiki article, were a covert organization whose full scope of duties remained hidden even from senior Imperial officials. The Emperor has a documented history of building things outside the record. Primarch Zero is the theory that fits that history. He is outside the sequence not because he was erased, but because he was never registered. The Edict of Obliteration was never applied to him because you can't obliterate what was never inscribed. The 2nd failed. The 11th failed. Their memories were scoured from the minds of their brothers, their records deleted, their plinths left empty in the Investiary where Rogal Dorn could stand and call their absence a tragedy. Their legions were redistributed. Their names were excised. Zero has no plinth to leave empty. He was never meant to stand among the 20. He was built before the 20 existed as a concept, for a function the 20 were never designed to serve. He requires no legion of soldiers, no campaign to prosecute, no glory to accumulate. He requires only to exist in the place the Emperor built for him, generating silence in the face of the warp, holding the door shut with nothing more than his nature. This isn't confirmed Black Library canon. Games Workshop hasn't published a novel that names him. No codex entry assigns him a numeral. The concept of Primarch Zero is a forensic deduction, the only deduction that doesn't break the lore's own rules when you apply them consistently. The only answer to the Null Primarch problem that doesn't require you to explain why the Emperor destroyed his most critical anti-warp asset, or why a biologically impossible Null Primarch managed to lead a legion of soldiers the genocide process made incompatible with his existence. The community's instinct that the Null is an entity separate from the failures of the Great Crusade is correct. The community's assumption that he must occupy one of the 20 numbered slots is where the thinking went wrong. The Imperium counts its sons obsessively. It has to. 10,000 years of history is scaffolded on the 20 names,
18 remaining, 9 fall into chaos's embrace, 2 expunged to the most thorough silence in imperial history. Theologians argue the significance of each. Remembrancers reconstructed their campaigns. Chapters that no longer carry Primarch names still carry their genetic legacy in every legionary they produce.
The Investiary still stands in the Kath Mandau Precinct. 2 plinths still hold nothing. Rogal Dorn's words persist in the short story record. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they in fact been warnings that no one had heeded? Perhaps. But a warning and a weapon are different things. The 2nd and 11th were warnings, evidence that the Primarch project could produce failures, that great power could break in wrong directions, that the Emperor's sons weren't guaranteed to be equal to the missions they were given. Their erasure was a lesson the Emperor chose not to share with his surviving children. Their plinths are empty because what they represented failed. And somewhere below the Investiary, below the Forbidden Vault, below the dark cells where the Shadow Keepers keep their 10,000-year vigil over things too dangerous to release, there is a chamber that does not appear in any record.
A room that was never in the record, because its occupant was never meant to be in the record. He does not have a legion. He does not have a name in any imperial archive. He does not have a plinth in the Investiary, because the Investiary was built to honor the 20 sons of the Great Crusade, and he was never one of those sons. The damnatio memoriae was never applied to him, because there was no memory to condemn. There was never an inscription to scratch out. He was built before the sequence. He functions outside it. He has continued to function for 10,000 years through the death of the Great Crusade, through the Horus Heresy, through the Scouring, through the Long War, through the opening of the Great Rift, through every demonic assault that has reached the walls of the Imperial Palace and broken against them. The Imperium mourns its 18 surviving sons. It curses the 9 who fell to chaos. It keeps an uneasy silence about the 2 empty plinths at the 2nd and the 11th. None of that has anything to do with him. He is the one the Emperor never gave a number, sitting silently in the dark, keeping the monsters out. If you want more stories like this, subscribe.